Hello, my name is Mike Konczal. I'm a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and I blog at the site Rortybomb, and I am joined by...
I'm Aaron Bady. I blog at New Inquiry and Zunguzungu.
That is the way to say it, zunguzungu. That
Zunguzungu, yeah.
Excellent. I'm a huge, and this is another installment of Fireside Chats, a Blogging Heads weekly episode run by the Roosevelt Institute's Fellows Program, where we bring in many of our fellows, people like Dorian Warner, Mark Schmitz, Ellen Chesler, and get them talking with various people who we think are interesting and good time to talk to. And I am very excited to be joined by my friend and someone whose work I've respected for years and enjoyed for quite some time, Aaron Bady. Aaron blogs at Zunguzungu and has now moved. We both, I became aware of your work in about early 2009. And I think we were both, I was writing under a pseudonym at the time, and your identity was not very public. And now I feel like we've both kind of gone off in a little bit bigger circles now. And it's kind of interesting to watch both of our careers move along. And my blog has just moved to the Roosevelt site, Next New Deal, and you've moved to the New Inquiry, which, can you tell us a little bit about the site?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, I moved there before I really knew very much about it. I had sort of interacted with some of these people online, but I basically just moved zunguzungu there. And it's one of the things I like about it is how broadly construed its purview is. I mean, what the New Inquiry is a kind of intentionally empty term, I think, because it's a kind of opening outward inclusiveness, and it's been really interesting to move my blog away from the kind of janky WordPress, zunguzungu.wordpress.com kind of screams a certain level of disinstitutionality. So it's interesting to see how some people kind of address me a little bit differently now that I have that sort of New Inquiry frame around it.
I always felt bad writing things. Like, I would write things about the economy, and some of them would circulate, and I always felt bad that at the end it would say, like, .wordpress.com. Even though I think, well, both of us were writing, we're quite quality works, like, it's still that kind of weird, like, there is something that's kind of rogue about it and kind of cool, like, I'm doing this on a WordPress site, go, you have your credentials and I am, but on the other hand, it's also kind of like, could WordPress just take my stuff or shut me out one day and I wouldn't know kind of thing, like it's a weird not having that kind of credentialization around where you write is kind of always a little bit weird.
And the strange thing where you have that, it actually puts advertisements at the very end of a post. But if you're logged in, you don't notice them. It doesn't show them to the person who's actually writing the post. So there's a sort of way that you're actually advertising, and you don't even see the ads because, presumably as the author, you might be the one person who might object and to whom the ads are not aimed. So in a way, it's nice to kind of move away from that and have some control over that.
Well, excellent. So, and this is also, I think, one of your first online video debuts. Blogging Heads is always kind of fun because you get to see the people who you read, and you can kind of put a face and a voice. And, it's weird when you make that jump when you're, suddenly not just Zunguzungu, but you're Aaron Bady, who's now talking this way. How does that feel to kind of start to make those leaps? Because I noticed you were in a panel in New York recently, and, as you slowly bubble up and you're not just like kind of an anonymous blogger somewhere.
Well, I've actually had that experience quite a bit more recently because as I've been doing a lot of writing about local issues, about Occupy Oakland and Occupy Cal and things on campus. And, my picture is available. It's, if you click on the About Me page, you can see it. And I've actually had that experience of running in circles with people that I know on Twitter, and they recognize me, and they're like, "Oh, are you Zunguzungu?" Which is a very odd. It's a very sort of odd feeling, because part of, as you were saying, part of the nice thing about being on a kind of janky little WordPress platform is that the text kind of stands on its own. You put this idea out there into the world, and if people like it, they like it, and if they don't, they don't. And it can feel like it has nothing to do with you as an author. and so having that experience of suddenly having to think about, well, okay, I actually have to frame it by me as an author in some sense. Doesn't bother me too much, but it is, you're right, like it causes you to approach blogging in a slightly different way, or it adds another level of awareness that you can't help but kind of factor in. And some of what I've always found to be attractive about blogging is that a lot of that is stripped away. You don't have to worry about, how will this impact my career or something, because it's not part of a career. Blogging is so separate. It's just something you do because it's a worthwhile thing in and of itself. And so to have to think about how this interacts with the rest of my life, with my persona away from my computer, and the wherever it is that bloggers do whatever it is they do, it does. There's a kind of thing you have to guard against, I think, to keep it from to keep that awareness of an audience from changing how you actually write.
Right. I remember you wrote a great post on WikiLeaks, which I think for a lot of people kind of really defined it as a political project, and it blew up quite big on the internet. And I remember like a few weeks later, the Atlantic Monthly profiled you on their website. And it was like really weird because it was like, that's Aaron, like that's zunguzungu, and there he is being profiled. And I knew him when he was blogging about a paper about The Wire that he wrote, and all this stuff. So one of the reasons I started reading you is because way back when is because you wrote a lot about what was going on with the UC system, the University of California higher education system, which is in some ways one of the real models for the country. The way it was designed has been ported to a bunch of different states, and it's also the front line of the battle about privatization, tuition, student debt, what the college should do, online education, and you're in the English department there. Is it English
Yes.
or literature?
Yeah.
And my wife is also a graduate student at UC, and I've always found those debates very important because I think they speak a lot about the social contract, about what we want public goods to do, how debt and the way we kind of condition people to exist in society, and the way we have people build their careers is very much under a contentious debate right now, and that's been amplified by the Occupy movements. One point I always, a lot of people have done really great reporting about Occupy as, from the front lines. A lot of people have done terrible reporting, but there's a lot of great stuff. But one thing I don't see a ton of acknowledgement is that Occupy really comes out of college campuses over the past couple of years. You see it in Puerto Rico, you see it in South America, and you also saw it in 2009 in Berkeley, where they occupied Wheeler Hall, where you were teaching classes, and I believe you wrote about it at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this funny thing where I think a lot of the people who were involved, I was much more involved as an observer, as a someone who was sort of present and trying to be reflective. But I've come to know a great many of the organizers in 2009 of what was then it was Occupy California, and a lot of people are sort of surprised to find out that Occupy California was a thing long before Occupy Wall Street, before anyone had heard of Occupy Wall Street. And there's this way in which here at Berkeley and in the University of California, this is all Occupy Wall Street and the experience of the last 7 or 8 months, whatever it's now been, there seems to be a real kind of continuity out of the struggles that have been going on in a very local sense in Wheeler Hall, in the classroom I was meant to teach on this day in 2009 was occupied by a group of students, and I wrote extensively about it because it was a really powerful and traumatic experience, because the first thing the university did was bring in riot cops from all around the county, and there was a huge standoff, which not even a standoff. The experience of it was really one of watching a crowd develop to see what was happening, and then the police proactively attacking that crowd. And it kind of forced us to be thinking about Occupy. Even someone like me, I was not one of the organizers. I was not part of that movement, although sympathetic at that time. But it brought me in 2009 into a conversation that feels like it's kind of gone national in the last 7 months. And so I talked with some of these people, that were much more, that were, actively occupying in 2009. And they have a certain kind of, there's a certain kind of shock. Like, wow, in 2009 we were saying "Occupy everything." That was our slogan, and everyone told us that was crazy, and that nothing would ever come of that. In fact, I wrote some things on my blog that now, in retrospect, I'm kind of like, wow, I would never write that now. About sort of this whole idea of Occupy. It sounds good, but it's not. It'll never take off. And it sort of has, and so I have a lot of these friends who are kind of, it's like they had this child and sent it out and it exploded everywhere. And they wouldn't take that kind of paternal ownership of it, but there was definitely a moment in which the California student movement kind of took this idea that had been germinating in all sorts of places, and really pushed the ball forward in a way that has, a couple of years on now, has borne a lot of fruit.
Yeah, I'm holding up to the camera something called the Occupy Handbook, which I was sent a review copy of, which is a bunch of interviews and short articles by prominent economists and writers on the economy. So Paul Krugman, Brad DeLong, who's at California, Felix Salmon, Jeff Madrick, Jillian Teddy writes for the Financial Times. Pretty A-list. Some are political, some are not. Dave Graeber's in there, which is interesting. And it's a collection of in some ways, it's a collection of just left liberal politics. We should have a higher minimum wage. Unions are probably good and we should encourage them, so on and so forth. But it's underneath the rhetoric of Occupy. And I can understand why that worries people about co-option and a bunch of other things. But on the other hand, it's also a mainstreaming of a bunch of other things, because coming with it is a whole thing about inequality. It's about public access and so on. And but to jump forward, 2011. A lot of stuff was going on in New York, a lot of stuff was going on everywhere, but for a lot of people, Oakland and Berkeley, and also UC Davis, which we'll talk about in a minute, were real big, everyone kind of knows about Brooklyn Bridge in New York, but what was going on in Oakland, part of it was that I lived there for a while, so I knew the intersections, but, watching these streams of tear gas containers going off on 12th Street, and, huge waves of police, and, these kind of helicopter shots of just tear gas in the streets and flashbangs. And it was very shocking to see the police that active. And then separately, one of the most iconic images of police violence in Occupy was the pepper spraying of the students who were sitting down peacefully protesting at UC Davis. And beyond just the violence done to those students, the kind of casual, I'm sure you thought about it, but and you can phrase it better, but this kind of mechanical, I'm doing my job look on the cop's face. He's not gleeful and he's not even shameful, but this kind of, the way violence has been done to students across UC, I think, has been shocking for a lot of people. And, a bunch of things. I've just written a big piece for Jacobin, which hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss, about incarceration and the way policing has become really normalized in our policy framework and the way we view what government does. And just recently, the report, did you see put it out? Hopefully you'll be able to explain it. A report just came out about the events that happened at Davis, and you've written about it, Reclaim, UC's written about it. I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, it's been these reports are very, at their best, they're kind of a double-edged sword because they take so long to come out. It's been months. It's been since November, since the pepper spray incident happened. And so a lot of the kind of popular outrage dies down a little bit. The national attention moves elsewhere. And there was this moment in November, after that happened, everyone was looking at UC Davis. And the week before, there had been beatings at UC Berkeley, where I was there. I was not beaten, but I was right there, where the police were essentially assaulted a crowd of peaceful protesters with linked arms. And at that moment in November, it was plainly obvious that the police were out of control, and that, whoever gave that order should not be allowed to give orders to police, and that, real disciplinary action needed to be taken. And then you have this 4-month period where you're waiting for a report to come out to clarify exactly what happens. And then by the time it comes out and clarifies exactly all the things that were evident in November, a lot of people's attention has moved on. The people who are very invested in it read the report, but the amount of public scrutiny that the administration has to deal with, that the police departments have to deal with, is much less. And so so it's this weird way that you get a confirmation of everything that you said was the case in November, but a lot of the momentum to actually do anything about it is gone. And so the Davis report is a really damning document. It's just, the police had no legal right to move the protesters at all. Those protesters had a right to be there. And so the very basis of police action from the start was non-existent. And this was also true at Berkeley. And then, it details that the Davis report, which is Cruz Reynoso and then Kroll are the two big names. That report details exactly the breakdown in various chains of command, various miscommunications, and then just people going rogue and doing things that they weren't supposed to do. It outlines very carefully what all the procedures are supposed to be, and then it shows exactly how none of them were followed. And these people didn't do what they were supposed to do, and this happened. And, it's a damning document of a great deal of administrative incompetence. And the first thing that you get, as soon as it came out, the president of the UC, Mark Yudof, had a press release where he said, I've given it a cursory reading, and I look forward to working with Linda Katehi, the UC Davis chancellor, to put in place various reforms. And she released a similar kind of press release, which is where she said, I take personal responsibility, which means I'm gonna make sure that this sort of thing never happens. And so it's really nice to have confirmed and to be able to see exactly where things went wrong. At the same time, you see the way that the process shields the very people who caused it all to happen, and Linda Katehi should not be chancellor of UC Davis. If there's anything that should cause you to resign, it should be her activities there. But that's probably not going to happen, absent significant protests and organization, which is happening. People are doing things.
Right. And you were, she's the same person. If I remember, there's a Crooked Timber post that said she helped advise, was it Greece, about how to have police on campus. Did you read this?
I did. I don't know the details of it too clearly.
Right, but the whole notion of policing campuses and protests in this aggressive manner, right? Places like Occupy New York are somewhat purposely, throttling the line of public-private spaces, in part because there aren't many public spaces anymore. But a campus with a campus protest, to have it be responded to with police that aggressively, and in a situation where the whole idea is to have young people or people in general around each other, learning and communicating and agitating and thinking and discussing, to have that viewed as something that needs a police response that immediate, and that presumption of a requirement of policing to disperse and monitor and organize is really frightening. And both of you and Reclaim, I think it was Reclaim UC as well, talked a little bit about the distinction between people who should and should not be on campus. I forgot the exact term they used, but I'm kind of curious if you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, non-affiliates is this word that comes up again and again and again. And it's actually, it's a wonderful, this is where this document is wonderful, because what it shows us how Linda Katehi and the police department get to the point where they're pepper spraying their own students. And the way they do it is that they convince themselves essentially that Occupy Oakland is invading them, and they know it's not actually Occupy Oakland, but all the connotations of Occupy Oakland as this sort of is very racialized, very this insurgent population of outsiders that is kind of what the Occupy phenomenon seemed to have represented to them, and so they have this idea that the Davis Quad is filled with non-affiliates. And that just means, someone who's not affiliate, not a current UC Davis student. They can actually, the legal right to send in the police, they would have had a right to disperse the crowd if it was a crowd of non-affiliates. It turns out it wasn't. But that concept, the idea that someone who is not affiliated with UC Davis, someone who is not a current UC Davis student, faculty, or staff, has no right to be there, and whose presence is a kind of clear and present danger that requires policing, is this amazing crystallization of a lot of what the crisis of the public university is right now, which is this idea that if you're not paying tuition, or if you're not getting a paycheck from the university, if you don't have some kind of lawful business to do in the university space, then you have no right to be there, and your presence is not only to be policed, but becomes the kind of casus belli for policing. It becomes the reason, the pretext for using violent force. And this is such a radical transformation in what the University of California was chartered to be. I mean, the University of California, it's a land grant university. But more than that, it's the chartering documents are pretty clear that it's meant to be something along the lines of, it's meant to be a public trust, which is legally defined as something along the lines of a public waterway. And the job of the regents, the UC regents, are given, they effectively own all the universities. There are these signs that say, this is property of the UC regents. I get my check from the UC regents. You write checks to the UC regents. These people actually have a kind of ownership of the university that's legally quite direct. But the reason they have that ownership is to protect the campuses as spaces for the public. They have this kind of dictatorial power over what happens on campus so that they can make sure it's open to the university, that it's open to California as a whole, that it's completely integrated with the state as a whole. Because the purpose of the University of California had always been, up until like the 70s and 80s when this started to be rethought, it was always to educate all the students of California and to be an economic boon to the state of California. And so this idea that if you're from Oakland, or if you're even from Davis, if you're from Occupy Davis but not Occupy UC Davis, that you have no right to be on campus and that your presence on campus is a problem. To me, this runs at direct cross purposes to everything the university had stood for 100 years. But as you say, this is one of these, the public university, the idea of the public university is in a kind of crisis, and a lot of people are talking about, do we want that kind of, people are questioning, do we want that kind of public university? Can we still have that kind of public university? And so that the figure of the UCPD cop attacking Davis students because they were deemed to be representative of this sort of external threat, this Occupy non-affiliate thing, or even the prospect that non-affiliates might come in the future. It's kind of the perfect endpoint for this kind of thinking, where the university gets kind of closed off and isn't seen as being integrated with the state as a whole or the community as a whole, but only people who have a direct lawful relationship with it.
In a direct financial relationship, too.
A direct financial relationship, absolutely, yeah. In fact, just to play off of that, there's recently at UC Berkeley, there have been some of the people who were beaten, who were clubbed by the police on November 9th, some 13 of them are now facing charges for things like obstructing a public thoroughfare, resisting arrest, a sort of dog's breakfast of nonsensical charges. The first of the 13 has been dropped. This has been infuriating, as you can imagine, but the kind of perfect distillation of the insanity of it is that these 13 people, 12 of the 13, were hit with legal stay-away orders, where until the charges were resolved, they were legally required to stay away from campus. And these are people who had not been convicted of anything; they're not likely to be convicted of anything. But in the meantime, they're legally banned from being on campus, except for lawful. How is it put? Like lawful business. I think lawful business was the phrase. And so you have
students can go to class, but then they can't hang out on the quad, kind of thing.
Exactly. If you're doing something that has a kind of economic meaning, right? Like if you're paying for classes, that's lawful business. If you're being paid to do services or something, that's lawful business. But anything that doesn't involve a transaction of some kind, you have no right to be there. So just occupying space, hanging out on the quad, that's not lawful business. And that to me seems like it's a consequence of legalizing what is and isn't appropriate campus behavior, but it's also the kind of end point of this logic of privatization, of thinking of the university as the sum of the economic transactions that compose it.
That's really fascinating. There's two ways on I kind of approach it. One is I want to talk a little bit about the idea of insider-outsiders. I wrote a thing for Jacobin, which you had a chance to read. It should be live by the time this Blogging Heads is live, about incarceration. Are you up for talking about policing for a few minutes, and then we'll go back to the privatization?
No, we've been talking about policing.
Well, it's true. So one thing, so I wrote this thing, and the idea was, it seems like you don't want to overread what could be random things kind of clustering together, but it does seem like there is an elite movement away from our current prison regime and our current policing incarceration regime. For those who don't know, we by far incarcerate the most percentage of our population of any country. It's roughly about 1%, or maybe about 1.4. And then there's a huge secondary group of people who are out of prison, but they still kind of exist in this legal netherworld where they have been convicted of a crime. So their ability to vote, their ability to receive certain government services is very much in question, and their ability to get certain licenses to perform jobs. It seems like that is starting to move against it. You've seen a lot of elite press reporting is much more critical of it than we've seen in the past. Crucially, I think a lot of kind of elite Republican thinkers and politicians who can kind of sense the way the party's moving are starting to move against it. Grover Norquist has written about it. Mitch Daniels at Indiana is trying to reduce prison sentencing. And elite center-right thinking is usually a good predicator of where Democrats will be in 10 years, so we're likely to see that transition over to Democrats. And what I wanted to write a little bit about is, I think there's a good critique of that. There's a good critique of that. The question is, why have we ended up here? And there usually tends to be pretty, I don't want to say blunt, but pretty straightforward stories. There's stories about racism, which I think are very accurate. There's stories about economic incentives. This system makes certain people well off, and the people who suffer under it are disproportionately have less political representation. So that kind of balances out, which I think is also true. But I think there's an ideological story. I kind of trace through. I do a close reading of James Q. Wilson's Broken Windows to kind of talk about how neoconservatism, which is a big wave of government ideology, has combined with neoliberalism. And we talk a little about some about ways all these classical liberal thinkers are kind of real law and order people. And Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon is the classic example. And the way that kind of converges in our policy apparatus right now. But just for the purpose of this conversation, I went back and read James Q. Wilson's Broken Windows, and I had always had the impression of it that it's kind of like community policing, and we're all in this together, and let's take care of the neighborhood. But it's actually a really intense conservative document,
isn't it?
And There's 2 points to it that I think there's a lot going on in it, but there's there's two arguments that I think people don't necessarily think of when they think of the police, and I think they are the arguments of the police now. And one is that the police are not there to solve crimes. The police are there to maintain order. And that involves determining who is an insider, who is an outsider, and strictly policing those boundaries. So it doesn't shock me that, the police have ended up in this space where they're determined to figure out who belongs here in this space. Mm-hmm. I wrote the thing a little while ago, so it was before Trayvon Martin was murdered in Florida, quite sadly. And, as we go back and we look through a lot of the logs about George Zimmerman and what he was up to, there's obviously a huge racial component, but there's also a component of the fact that Zimmerman thought this person did not belong in the neighborhood, and it was his job as captain of the watch to go harass people who shouldn't be there, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that is in Broken Windows that I think is very useful is to critique and think about is there's a kind of classical liberal idea that things that should be crimes are things that cause direct harms. That's where the government's main job is to interfere, right? Whatever I'm doing, as long as it's not a harm to someone else, is legitimate. There's a reason I want to do it, and if there's an interaction where we both are, consenting, then there's no harm there. And he says the main point of the argument is to kind of create a logic for going after squeegee men in New York, to go after the homeless, to go after people with carrying minor amounts of drugs. And his argument is that these things, these kind of nuisances, and kind of obnoxious public behavior from the minds of certain people create the conditions for disorder, which is kind of why they're so freaked out about all this imagery of lurid people, I think. When you look at the Davis situation, you see this imagery of lurid Occupy Oakland people showing up, even if they're not directly breaking the law, right? Even if they're not throwing rocks, they're creating the conditions for disorder. And I know you read Broken Windows a little while ago, and I saw you tweeted it, and you were kind of shocked to read it as well. So I was kind of curious what your thoughts were about it.
Yeah, I mean, your article, the Jacobin piece, was really useful for me in kind of synthesizing a lot of different things that are sort of floating around in and around Broken Windows, which has become it helping me understand to what an extent Broken Windows and the kind of policing that flows out of it is a contradiction of the ways I think we like to think we are policed, which is that if you commit a crime, or if someone thinks you commit a crime, then the police's job is to detect whether or not you committed it, and you have all these rights that protect you as that process goes forward. And so this is how I approached a protest at UC Berkeley. But I was sort of thinking, the police will arrest people if people go past a certain line, right? Like, the police will not start to beat you with clubs or pepper spray you unless you've done something that in their eyes warrants that kind of response. You expect that police violence will only rear its head once some kind of crime has been committed. And what we saw there was not that at all. And what we've come to understand about what happened at UC Davis is that it wasn't that they at UC Berkeley they were worried about another people's park, which is still it's still university property, but it has been it had been taken over by occupiers back in the 70s, and has become this kind of space that's external to the city in lots of ways, even though cops walk through it and everything. But they had this idea that something like that might happen on campus again, and so they had to use preemptive force to prevent it from happening. And it's very much the logic of Broken Windows, right? If we let people set up tents on the quad, then next thing you know, People's Park will happen again. Right. And at UC Davis, it was exactly the same thing. Once they had determined a little bit that actually most of these students were students, that they were not non-affiliates. But one of those deans who actually had a little bit more knowledge of what was going on said in an interview to the Kroll Report writers he said, well, we knew that they were mostly students, but we were looking further down the road. In 2 or 3 weeks, this might become a kind of haven for people from Occupy Davis or Occupy Sacramento or Occupy Oakland, and so that if we let them set up tents now, even though they might have a legal right to set up tents, if we let them do that now, God knows what will happen going forward. It's exactly the logic of broken windows, where the purpose of police is to kind of prevent a situation from coming about where disorder is possible and then might possibly result in a crime, which means that the police have tremendous preemptive power. And this is something we've seen since 9/11 particularly, but it's been a long-running trend, as you see, going back to something like broken windows, to sort of move the moment of police intervention forward, to preempt crime, to preempt disorder, rather than after the fact coming in like Sherlock Holmes and figuring out who did what. And it means one's experience of law and order is radically different. I think you put it nicely that the police are more concerned with order than law, and that law kind of takes a back seat to order in that sense.
Right. So much of our media, especially for a certain kind of middle-class privilege, your main view of the police comes through media, right? It doesn't come through people actually policing your neighborhoods. And every cop show is about, every Law and Order opens with a murder in the first minute, right? Or they find a dead body in the first minute. And the entire show is this kind of Weberian exercise, and the police have to muster evidence, they have to collect it, and then they have to, show it to an independent panel of judges, and they make the case, right? And but it's all after the fact. And Wilson's actually very, very dismissive of that. He thinks he thinks that was something that was kind of introduced into cities in the mid-century, where detectives used to be. He said detectives used to be kind of shady people. They were like what we would think of as private eyes. You'd hire them to spy on people or kind of dig up dirt on people. But then it became mainstream and professionalized and absorbed in the police force. And he thinks this was a big disaster. We kind of need to go back. And the essay is also very telling because he's always. Be careful how I say this. He takes it as granted that the police will always be pushing the boundaries of the law, and the law is somewhat improvisational at the edge. So it doesn't shock me that when you tear apart something like the UC Davis thing, that everyone's kind of shrugging and everyone's kind of pointing the finger at everyone else, because there isn't about accountability per se. Right? It isn't about making sure that it's not like a machine where the force goes out, we have to be able to account for why it went out and that it hit the target correctly or whatever. It's all about, he's quite clear. He's quite clear about public nuisance laws as being essential, and he attacks utilitarians, but what I think we would call civil libertarians, for saying, why are you harassing, squeegee men? Why are you harassing someone with a dime bag worth of pot on them, and putting them in jail, and putting them, bringing all this force against them. And they'd say, well, even though they're not necessarily harming someone, like no one stands up and says, I was harmed by this. It is the potential for it that requires that kind of intervention. And he's like, this might mean we arrest a lot of homeless people, and that's, and a lot of people will point and say, what good was that? And they'd say, well, that's the point, is that you don't actually point at all the murders that would come if we set up another People's Park, so to speak, in UC Davis. So,
and the argument, there's this argument ends up with a sharp distinction between insiders and outsiders, but it also sort of presumes this pre-existing distinction between insiders and outsiders. In Broken Windows, he makes a big deal of saying there's a kind of social consensus that sort of precedes the squeegee man showing up or the homeless people showing up, where the community has already kind of decided the way it wants to constitute orderliness, and the police just enforce that against these kind of this squeegee man shows up and attacks your car with his squeegee. But there's this way that allows it to import in a sense of the community that has a right to the space, that was part of this primordial social contract that hates squeegee men, and the invader who comes in after the fact, and so it's this way that it allows it both ends up with the force of the police baton distinguishing who's an insider from who's an outsider, and it gets what legal legitimacy it has from that pre-existing sense of who's an insider and outsider that it doesn't have to say too much about, because after all, we all really know who the insiders are. We all know, when you talk about the difference between Davis and Oakland, there's a whole set of associations that distinguish, what a kind of sleepy, mid-sized agricultural town in the middle of California is from whatever it is that Oakland represents in the popular imagination.
Right. I'm not going to dig it up, but in one of James Kewelson's earlier books about the police, I believe it's called Varieties of Policing Behavior, but it's very, very academic, and it's case studies and kind of ethnographic research about these police. He's starting to build up this theory that he ends up co-writing in Broken Windows, and I believe he writes that you could tell disorder, and he's like listing how people are being disorderly, and he says, drunks and prostitutes. And he says, someone wearing a do-rag. And I believe he also refers to interracial couples. Now, this is the late 60s, right? And, cultural norms are one thing, but that's precisely the problem, right? Is that it's clear when you actually have to do some ethnography and you see that it is the police who are projecting their kind of division of insider-outsider, and sometimes that works with the neighborhood and sometimes it doesn't. And that kind of creates a whole second set of problems. I want to go back to the privatization notion. One thing, I'm somewhat involved with various debates about the policy around student loans. And as I wrote something for Dissent where I characterized it as three crises. There's the crisis of just high unemployment and high underemployment, and young people are graduating into a terrible job market. So any kind of student debt is going to really, really hit them pretty hard. There's the way student loans function as kind of a legal creation. When you pull back the curtain on the debt, the kind of plumbing on it is very repressive. It's very unfair. It's very harsh towards people. It's much harsher than someone who has gambling debt, for instance. And then the third crisis has to do with the nature of the university going forward. And I've gotten a little bit of touch and go fights with people. And I argue in the piece that the mid-century California master plan is kind of the target. We want something where we conceive of, without going into the details, we're a little bit behind time, we conceive of as public good something that is accessible to those who display the competency to get in. And the system has problems, right? I mean, it piggybacks on all kinds of problems with K through 12 education. It's historically been meant as a way of excluding certain people and certain types of people, and it's always, that university has always been tied to the needs of Cold War infrastructure and research and the terror about Sputnik and et cetera. I'm kind of curious what you think of, it's open to attack for people who are kind of nostalgic for this, Rooseveltian, social democratic, Keynesian vision of what the government should do, which I am, proud badge where I work. I work for the FDR Presidential Library. I'm very much in the pocket. I'm curious what you think, because I see other people who both have more radical critiques of the existing system, which I kind of want to table, but people who would say, it's actually. Looking backwards, there were so many problems, we need to really reconceive of something brand new. I'm kind of curious where you fall into this as someone who's thought a lot about it.
What I think is that there's this...
Or to put it differently, where do we want to end up? What kind of university do we want to end up with? Is probably a simpler way to ask the question.
Exactly. I mean, and that's where the California Master Plan is useful to me, because it expresses an ambition. It was never something that was finished. It was always politically contentious. And this is something people don't, I think, have an adequate sense of, is how hard the progressive and left proponents of the system had to work to put it into place. How hard fought it was in the 50s and 60s. And how incomplete it was. And, there are all these ways in which this ambition, which is essentially to create a single unified system where, if the people who get out of high school with the best grades go straight to the UC system where they get a free education, the people who are sort of not quite at the top level can go to the CSUs, the California State Universities, and get a free education. And then people who are not quite at that level can go to community colleges and maybe work their way up into a CSU or UC system. And it's this unified system to essentially make sure that wherever you are, like wherever your class rank is when you graduate from high school, which is also free, you have a path that's open to you. And it was never complete. It was never perfect. There were lots of holes. They had to build twice as many universities as existed in order to absorb this population. But what it represented was a statement by the state of California to say, there is a place for you no matter who you are, where you are. We are building a system that has a place for you to get an education. And at the very top of it, I mean, the UC Berkeley is a world-class institution that used to be free. You could get a free education at UC Berkeley that was as good or better as Princeton, Harvard, whatever. And there's all sorts of radical critiques, I think, that are completely cogent of the possibility of ever doing that, of ever completing that project, and so people will say, look, this could happen in the 50s and 60s because of a certain kind of post-war conjunction of forces, a certain, political alignment that in a lot of ways was not possible after the 60s, and that may well be true, and I think it's a thing where it's hard to imagine that the master plan finding much political purchase in the Congress we have right now. But that said, that ambition is something that I think is incredibly important to say that, that there is a kind of meritocratic carrot at the end that there is a place for you in this system. It is something that I think we don't always take account for the extent to which we presume that's true. We've had the benefit for decades, for many decades of a higher education. I went to Ohio State. I got a great education there that I wouldn't have been able to. If I had been paying private school prices, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And so many people have that story, but we often don't think about what that means at a societal level. And so I think the value of the master plan for me is not so much a kind of, political, it's not a set of goalposts that we need to get past, as a kind of reminder of a set of values, of a real ambition of what we as a society can accomplish. I don't think we'll ever get there. In the 60s, they didn't think they would get there, and they didn't get there. But it was a sense of what they hoped to do, or the direction they hoped to move. And so what I find most worrisome about everything that's happening is, there's the individual events that are happening. There's the rising tuition. There's particular instances of privatization, but we're also losing a sense of what it would mean as a society to hold this as something that we aspire to do, as something that we would even take for granted, or not take for granted, but speak explicitly about this is what we hope to accomplish. I think we've had the benefit for a long time of sort of inheriting it from the baby boom generation, this institution that was available for them. It has been chipped away piece by piece by piece, and we sort of assume that it will always be there, even as it slowly disappears. And so right now is a time when we have to think about that thing as a thing that is worth fighting for, that can't be taken for granted, because it is going away. So I mean, that's my way of thinking about the master plan, is that it's not so much something we want to reestablish or ever could reestablish, but it's a statement of a set of goals and ideals about higher education that are, I think most people have internalized in a lot of ways they maybe don't even think about that much.
Right, yeah. Kevin, we'll link to it. Kevin Carey just wrote a great piece about what's going on with UCAL's community colleges, and they're getting really hit by funding problems. And all those students are going straight off to the for-profit colleges, which terrible graduation rates. They're basically designed as kind of a money-sucking scheme. Students themselves expressed great regret afterwards, statistically, compared to people who go to community colleges. And you're seeing it being shredded at every level, and it's that kind of reprivatization of that space, I think, is a huge problem, both as practical policy matter, and as you said, a kind of conceptual, like, let's think through this as something other than a privatized game, as an investment in human capital that can be remonetized after the fact, in debt transactions, all of it. We're starting to run a little low on time, so I want to talk a little bit about The Wire. I want to talk a little bit about two things you write a lot about, The Wire and Teddy Roosevelt separately. You got about 15 minutes for both. So I first started reading your stuff, I think, because you wrote about The Wire. You wrote about some really great stuff about the way the internal structures of all the characters work. And I think you see a lot, there's just a big lecture by philosopher Zizek, which you linked to. Walter Ben Michaels talks about this a lot, about The Wire as pretty much a straightforward class narrative, something that's about capitalism. David Simon's very big about this. Capitalism is his kind of Greek gods and his Greek tragedy. And it's all about these, people trying to push against these institutions, but really institutions are just grinding them into dust, and most of the actions kind of are counterproductive, or at best maybe just reify the problems that they're already trying to deal with. And you've always pushed against this in some very interesting ways, and I always like talking about The Wire, so I'm wondering if you could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think The Wire is about the city as a state of disinvestment. The Wire is really about these spaces that happen when capital withdraws from them. Baltimore is this, this is not Baltimore, the city filled with exploited labor, or Baltimore as a kind of population of workers who are being abused by the capitalist system, who are embedded in a system that controls them. I mean, what I find so interesting about the Baltimore of The Wire is this sense of it as just a forgotten space, that even capital isn't that interested in Baltimore anymore. Right. And so what happens once capital has disappeared? What happens when even the police have no real, don't have a tremendous economic function? The west side of Baltimore is this kind of open frontier in the Wire, and that's why they use a lot of the kind of cowboy tropes and the sense of it as an open space, because it's essentially unpoliced. It's not usefully embedded into relations of capitalization. And so there's this way in which the reading of The Wire that you get from someone like Walter Ben Michaels, you get this sense of capitalism as this totalizing system, as a sort of it's essentially like a lot of Marxist thinking about capitalism comes from a place of assuming one's total embeddedness in capitalist relations. You can't escape from them. You're stuck in them. The experience of so many characters in The Wire is just this, like, of having been left behind, and I think it really interestingly reflects something that is really true about a lot of. Capital moves geographically. Detroit is this space that was once the center of American capitalism, and now it's completely marginal. Now it's not completely marginal, but you know what I mean. Like it has become extraneous in so many ways.
It's not the arsenal of democracy, is my favorite phrase for Detroit, which is hard to imagine now.
Yeah, and so what to me is most interesting about The Wire is that sense of the subjectivity that remains afterwards. That what is it like to live in a world where all the kinds of societal narratives that one grew up to expect have kind of moved on and left you behind. What is it like to be a stevedore after the ships have stopped coming in? What is it like to live in America and as an American when Baltimore doesn't really feel like part of America and isn't treated as part of America? That's the first scene of The Wire is this sort of interesting debate that McNulty has with this guy on the street, essentially about like what the meaning of America is in this particular site, and so that's where reducing it to class struggle in a lot of ways gets us away from that sense of in which so many of the people in The Wire are incorporated not as a laboring class, not as workers, but as people who can't get work. They can't even become embedded in a class relationship. And that's where so much of the narrative energy of the show goes. And so that's the thing you kind of lose if you talk about it in strictly the kind of class terms I think Walter Ben Michaels has often fallen into. Zizek is a little different. I mean, I think he's a lot stranger. He's a much kind of stranger Marxist in certain ways. I'm curious what you took from that lecture that you thought was interesting.
It was interesting. I liked. So there's something to try to get a topology of the way the different characters in the show, especially characters with more formal responsibilities, try to resist the system in some ways, and the ways that is either counterproductive, as in it doesn't really do anything that they want it to do, in ways that it's reifying, that it actually emboldens what the system does already, and in ways that it actually does create space where people, where genuine progress can be made. I think in the class readiness that it's mostly, the institutions are all top down, right? The people basically struggle under them, and some put up a good fight, and some don't, but they all kind of end up in a metaphoric death, like McNulty does in the end. You brought up a good point, which you derived from the Zizek post or lecture. You were talking about the Jimmy McNulty gambit, which you referenced. Mike Davies. Mike Davies is a person who fabricated and exaggerated many of his reportings from Apple in a way that he then passed off as reportage, like strict reporting. And you mentioned that that's a lot like what Jimmy McNulty does. And what you pointed out was that McNulty ultimately, when he fabricates, slight spoiler for the last season of The Wire, Jimmy McNulty fabricates a serial killer to try to get funding. What he's doing is trying to just get the system to do what it's supposed to do anyway. The whole fabrication isn't to tear down the police, or it's just to get the funding necessary to get some capital to which to be productive as a police officer, and
to get a serial killer, because
right.
What's his name?
And to capture a real serial killer, Marlowe.
Yeah, Marlowe really is a serial killer.
Right, which is very, very important. And I'm still kind of ambivalent because some characters, some characters open up a boxing gym and make a real difference. And, these small struggles, I think, aren't easily absorbed in the framework of the idea that, all these systems ultimately destroy the people below them. I'm kind of curious how you read the institutional bias, because I think there tends to be that kind of class struggle Marxism, which views institutions just kind of either strictly replicating their conditions or, essentially, as we see with kind of late capitalism, grinding people who don't fit into the pre-exposed logic. I'm kind of curious what you read on that.
Well, I mean, I think Zizek's argument is ultimately about saying, and this is why we need a revolution. It makes a lot more sense, I think, if you kind of append that to the end of many of his arguments, because he's saying the problem with McNulty is that, the problem with all of these kind of interim moves to kind of shore up the system against the system's own contradictions, to kind of keep things going even as it tears itself apart. You sort of prevent the system from tearing itself apart just enough so that it can continue. His point is that the problem with doing that is that prevents the system from tearing itself apart, so you can create a new system. And he has this interesting argument about the black market as having been the thing that kind of kept the communist economy in Cuba or in the Soviet Union or wherever. The black market, the thing that the communists were trying to stamp out, was also the thing that allowed people to eat, because the communist economy wouldn't provide sufficiently for them. And so it kept the system moving forward and kept it going. I think that that's also the limitation of that as a reading of The Wire. Well, it's very illuminating, and for me, it kind of saves this season 5 a bit, which is most people's least favorite season, I think. But the limitation of that as a reading is that the the Wire is really invested, as you're saying, in the story of the guy who builds a boxing gym. David Simon was a journalist before he made TV and movies, and he carried a kind of journalistic, I think, aesthetic into The Wire, where there's such an interest in individual subjectivities and individual stories and individual struggles that is ethnographically fascinating, right? Like you really get a lot of really powerful, like a really powerful sense of what it is to occupy this particular subjectivity, which is attractive to most viewers, I think. But at the same time, if you sort of take revolution as your narrative endpoint in the way that Zizek is always working to kind of impose, you miss that thing that The Wire is so interested in doing. It is sort of understanding how people kind of carve out an existence in the shadow of capital, or in the shadow of capital's absence, that has nothing to do with actually an engagement in the system. People like Jimmy McNulty are obsessed with fighting the system, and I think The Wire critiques them for that. The most sympathetic characters in The Wire are people who are just trying to build a meaningful life and trying to connect with people around them, and build a kind of small level society of the people they care about, the families. Bubbles' story to me is one of the most powerful stories. Is reconnection with his family, reconnection with his community, reconnection with himself. Like that kind of story has almost nothing to do with confronting the system in the way that someone like Jimmy McNulty, who this show makes to be a kind of problematic character. That Bubble story exists in a world outside of the kind of narrative that I think Zizek wants to make The Wire into, and often happens when you see it strictly through a class struggle lens. You lose the parts of the narrative impulse, that journalistic sense that I think David Simon is really invested in.
And you also get a sense, and I got this from you from back in like '09. You get the sense of institutions as a side of reciprocal gift giving and obligations. I just read Dead a while ago, so I'm thinking of that as well. I'm thinking of who's Marcel Mauss. Is that the guy who wrote the Gift Economy?
Yeah, Marcel Mauss. Yeah.
Yeah, like the idea that I think you pointed this out, that when you first meet McNulty, like I rewatched the first season not so long ago, and you think of McNulty as this guy who's kind of someone who's willing to push the rules, but he actually does stumble into this whole thing when he accidentally, he doesn't expect the judge that he tells to about the murder of a witness to explode the way it does. He really is someone who's kind of caught off guard. And
he's always, what did I do?
He's like, what did I do? And he can do that as long as he kind of has this public protection of the judge. And the moment that goes away, the moment they start really digging into the money that fuels the drug economy and the campaign contributions, then suddenly he's on a boat in the middle of the docks.
Right.
And the way institutions aren't just about, I'm giving you orders, and they're not just about, this is, a way for me to, they're not these end poles where, I'm expressing, I'm doing all these things that I'm supposed to do as a member of this bureaucracy, but they're a lot about, what's the great word they use? Suction. Who has suction of who as both a gift-giving kind of economy. And I think that's I don't know if I agree with you about subjectivity per se. I think there are characters who have really in-depth arcs, and then there are characters who kind of wind up a little bit and then they go do stuff. Like, you never know really why McNulty wants to get Stringer Bell so much. I mean, there's a sense because he kind of carries the burden of the world, but that's usually not a great explanation. But there are characters with these very developed lives. But even for the characters who I find you kind of wind up and you never know why they're trying to do the things they do, you do have a really rich environment in which they exist in these reciprocal kind of gift-giving institutions. And, I'm regurgitating some stuff I read from you at times. But, one of the reasons Marlowe is so difficult and so dangerous is because he doesn't quite need anyone below him in his hierarchy, where, the Bell family, it's not Bell, it's the Barksdale family, is all about who owes who what favors, who's in and out of prison. Where Marlowe is just kind of this really kind of, this kind of end of capitalism where he's just completely immune from the needs of anyone around him. And it's why it's such a,
and he builds his entire gang is sort of built out of people who behave that way, who who are asocial in a certain very particular sense, right? Like you move up in the Marlowe hierarchy to the extent that you can pull yourself out of the kinds of chains of reciprocity that absorb someone like McNulty into society. Or, it seems like there's an intention there to provoke a confrontation between the kinds of gift economies, the kinds of reciprocal institutional relationship networks that we find in the first 3 or 4 seasons, and then confront them with this gang of people who are kind of radically asocial or radically connected only by capital, only by the production system that they kind of come together to produce. I think I once tried to claim that Marlowe was a sort of, crystallization of neoliberal ideology. But it's actually the other, as you were talking
just to throw in a quick point there, with the excluding all the Prop Joe stuff, the one time they do actually acknowledge social interactions is when they explain that Michael, slight spoiler, I think we're already past that point, when they're training a young kid, Michael, who's very talented to become a killer, that he shouldn't kill anyone he knows on the first time out. Right, which is like the only time they acknowledge like someone's like social relationships is to the point is that it could interfere with them killing someone, and then once they're a hardened killer, then they can do the killing of people they know. Which anyway, but go back to your point.
Well, I mean that's an interesting register of how social relations weakens you, right? In that way that, as you were saying, the Barksdale family, for all the strength they gain by being a family in that broad sense, they're also it's family that tears them apart. It's who's the it's Avon's sort of limited. It's his attachment to his nephew, and then the way when he breaks that attachment with his nephew, the way that has repercussions throughout the family structure. That's in a way that's ultimately what destroys them. That the Marlowe's gang is kind of they manage to avoid that problem in a certain kind of way while still flagging it as a problem. The first thing you do to become a killer, you have to kill a stranger. You're still depending on that person's strangeness, right? You're pretending as if you don't have any friends, right? You're just a person with a gun, and then there's a person receiving the bullet, right?
So I'm gonna move us along. You got a few more minutes?
Sure.
So your dissertation is about Teddy Roosevelt among some other people. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of.
Sort of. You can explain in a minute, but there's a pretty good vision of what the Republicans will want to accomplish next year, especially if they happen to take all 3 chambers of governance, or Congress and the presidency. And it's kind of this apocalyptic rant, but it's a very Randian vision of what government should do. And there's a lot of talk that essentially the Democrats, you might want to support them because you don't want the apocalypse, but it's not clear what their affirmative governing project for the next 4 years would be if they were reelected, other than kind of consolidating the gains that they just got. One mention is, and you see it all the time, is Teddy Roosevelt and Obama. And Obama gave a speech that was, I believe, the same location and maybe even an anniversary of Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech. And Obama's speech was all about rebuilding the middle class is the bulwark of society, and government needs to work for it, and et cetera. And you may or may not see some more populist-y things from the Democrats in the 2012 election. The Buffett rule, which has to do with high-end taxation of capital. I'm kind of curious. And then, a lot of centrist pundits don't like this. They think it's too class warfare-y. A lot of other people are worried about it. But it always seems like it comes back to this kind of Teddy Roosevelt vision of the executive branch. I think it's very related to something Jonathan Simon, and I talk about it a little bit in the Jacobin piece, is when you have this kind of crime-fighting regime, it's always about the governor, it's always about the prosecutor, it's always about the heroic executive, as opposed to this kind of FDR Roosevelt kind of view of government as this kind of regulator of interest. You think a lot about Teddy Roosevelt. I'm kind of curious what you think about Teddy Roosevelt as a role model for President Obama.
Well, I think the problem in so many ways is, what do you mean by Teddy Roosevelt? And Teddy Roosevelt is this funny historical figure in that, you can follow him through the turn of the century, through the teens up until World War I when he dies, and it can always seem as if he is this forceful personality, either imposing his will on government, on society, or sort of, or a personality as a kind of pure function of the zeitgeist. This is what a lot of progressive historians would say about him, was that he was this perfect crystallization of just the time and place. And so there's this, I was thinking as you were talking about the executive, there is this, I think, story that it's easy to tell about Teddy Roosevelt as this powerful individual, this individual figure who could, in a charismatic way, kind of move the country in the right direction. And the kind of project I'm doing is really much more interested in kind of what Teddy Roosevelt represents in society, and how does Teddy Roosevelt become possible. And the argument I would make about that is actually that Teddy Roosevelt is this guy who, when he gives that speech, he was running for the progressive. He was running for president as a third party candidate, essentially. He hadn't gotten the Republican nomination. He was really a political outsider at that point. This wasn't the President Roosevelt that commanded a powerful consensus across the board. This was Roosevelt in a lot of ways at his absolute most radical, his most progressive. And he could do that. He could be that kind of person, whether it was what he really believed or whatever, but he was appealing to a particular kind of political desire in 1914 or whatever it was, for a reform of the Republican Party, for a progressive overhaul of the entire system. I mean, he wasn't exactly running for the Occupy Party, but there was a definite stepping aside from the two-party system thing that enables his radicalism at that moment. And so it's really interesting then to kind of, if you flash forward to the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, as Teddy Roosevelt has there's an explosion in interest in Teddy Roosevelt basically starting in 1978. Like, that's when a lot of the biographies get written, and that's when he becomes a much more important figure. But he's this figure that gets reincorporated as this kind of, Republicans and Democrats alike model themselves after Teddy Roosevelt. Bill Clinton and John McCain, both say that Teddy Roosevelt is kind of their model of executive authority. And so for me, it's almost meaningless in a certain sense to appeal to, as Obama was doing in that gesture, like that gesture of emulating Teddy Roosevelt it's powerful, it's charismatic, it's appealing, but what is actually the substance of that? And so that to me remains the question, and it's what I think often makes him really attractive to a president, is that it's never quite clear what the substance is. Are you talking about the kind of most progressive 1914 version of Teddy Roosevelt, when he's this outsider third-party candidate, or are you talking about the Teddy Roosevelt in 1902, who's a kind of standard-bearing conservative with some reformist edges, but basically doing what the system requires. So these are the kinds of things I think about, and for me, like, it's to see Obama invoking the Roosevelt legacy there's nothing new about that. The presidency has become so Teddy Rooseveltian. There's so many different ways in which the performance of presidential authority, executive authority, is this picking up themes that Teddy Roosevelt first really used the press to create and to live up to. So the question then becomes like, okay, you're going to look to Teddy Roosevelt, but which Teddy Roosevelt? What are you actually going to do about it?
Right. What is the core of that, if you can summarize it in a minute? Like, when presidents pull on that, what are they trying to get at? Because is it strong executive authority? Is it that they're at the vanguard of something? Or what is your sense of that? Because everyone from Clinton to Obama, well, the past five presidents, right? Reagan through Clinton, through both Bushes, through Obama, all have had some sort of Rooseveltian moment, or Teddy Rooseveltian moment. I'm kind of, what are they grasping at? It's not his story.
Teddy Roosevelt is the ultimate synthesis of so many different contradictions in American identity. He's this millionaire New York. He's like, at the time, he was very much a Knickerbocker, like a New York City, old Dutch money. He was essentially a millionaire. He inherited like what would now be $1 million, that kind of fortune. And then what he does is he goes west to North Dakota and remakes himself as a cowboy. And so, you have this perfect synthesis of the turn of the century version of Red America, Blue America. Like, he was both a New York City cosmopolitan, Harvard educated, extremely erudite and fashionable gentleman of society, and then also he's a cowboy who fights Indians and catches varmints and hunts a lot, and he's both Sarah Palin and Barack Obama, as those things crystallize a sense of cultural identity. And to me, I think that's what a lot of people what a lot of executives have tried to do when they look to Roosevelt, is this person who could kind of be both of them, who could kind of manage those contradictions and still be one person. And that's why the narrative of Teddy Roosevelt, his personal narrative, is so powerful, is that everyone agrees he was one person, right? He was one, this incredibly powerful singular persona that we'll never see his like again. And so trying to perform that role, which contains within it all these contradictions of American identity, these like classic contradictions that go way, way back, becomes a way of showing that you yourself have synthesized them and brought them together and united red and blue in that way.
Good times. Well, Aaron, we should probably wrap it up. This was really fantastic. Thanks for joining me, and I encourage everyone to check him out at his new site at The New Inquiry.
Thank you, and everyone should check out your Jacobin article. It is really good. Looking forward to linking to it.
Well, thank you very much. All right. Take care.